Christian parenting.
Are you searching for the perfect gifts to celebrate the special moms, dads, and grads in your life? We are so excited about the Christian Parenting Moms, Dads, and Grads gift guide that has something for everyone. Whether you're honoring a new mom, a seasoned dad, or a recent grad, we've got you covered with thoughtful and meaningful gift ideas. Inside this gift guide, you're going to find some of our favorite resources, from Bibles and study tools to inspiring books, fun projects, and special bath products. You're guaranteed to find something special for the important people on your gift list this spring. You can visit christianparenting.org/gift guide to get your moms, dads, and grads gift guide today. The link is also at the bottom of the show notes if you need to find it there. Hello, and welcome to the Christian Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Steph Thurling, and this podcast is all about equipping you with thoughtful conversations and practical encouragement for every season of parenting, no matter where you are today. And I am so glad that you are joining us. Thank you so much for being here. Today is a really fun and interesting conversation. I am joined by Justin Brierley. He is a journalist, an author, and a Christian apologist. And we are talking about faith, skepticism, and how we as parents can walk with our kids through the big questions of life and faith. So Justin shares insights on how to engage skeptics. We talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection and how to make sense of suffering in a way that's honest and age-appropriate for kids. He also opens up about navigating faith with his own kids, the role of science in belief, and why modeling grace and humility is one of the most powerful things that we can do as parents. This conversation is full of wisdom for any parent who's ever wondered how to help their child wrestle well with doubt, pain, and the beauty of God's story. So I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Hello, Justin. Welcome to the Christian Parenting Podcast.
It's lovely to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it is great to have you here. Before we dive into talking about big questions about faith and skepticism and all of that good stuff that we're going to discuss, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and your family and all the things that are important to you?
Absolutely. Well, I work in journalism, so I host and produce podcasts, video, I write, I speak, and generally the area that I'm sort of best known for is Christian apologetics. So that's the intellectual defense of the Christian faith. So for many years, I hosted a radio show and podcast here in the UK called Unbelievable with a question mark, where I brought together Christians and non-Christians, atheists, skeptics together for dialogue and debate, and really enjoyed hosting that for many years. In more recent years, I've moved on to kind of more of a freelance focus and ministry, continuing to host those kinds of conversations, but across other podcasts as well. So there's one called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is a documentary style podcast that I host and is related to the book I last wrote on that subject. But yeah, that's kind of my life. I kind of see it as my calling to try and create these good conversations between the secular and Christian world. And it's been really fun to see what God has done in the process. Personally, I'm obviously a Christian, come from the UK, live not far from London. My wife is in church ministry. We have 4 kids. So they range from 20 years old. Our oldest, Noah, is 20. Grace is 16. Jeremy is 13. And Toby is 9 years old. And they're all amazing, very different to each other. But we're just blessed to have a family and kids who, are kind of delightful in so many ways. And we're just trying to do our best as Christian parents to guide them, to live out our faith in front of them. And that's me really.
Yeah. We're all just trying to do our best as Christian parents. And I wanted to have you on today because I think that part of doing our best as Christian parents is to have an understanding of why we believe what we believe. Because I think eventually our kids are going to come to us with questions and we want to be able to answer them confidently and not in a panic, but just confidently. So I'm excited to have you here to talk about skepticism and some of the arguments that people have against Christianity and how we can respond to those, both as believers and as parents. So I guess I kind of want to put you on the spot a little bit to start out with some basics. Which probably isn't on the spot for you because this is what you do. If you only had 5 minutes to convince a skeptic that God exists, what would you say?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, have you ever asked God if he exists, have you ever tried praying? Because I'm surprised at the number of skeptics I meet who have actually never tried the most obvious thing at all, which is simply to kind of put it out there and ask. And I feel like, that's a good place to start, because you want to gauge kind of how serious someone is, whether this is just an intellectual question or whether they're genuine about this. And I would hope that if someone's genuine, they might have sort of at some point in their life reached out and asked the question. But if I'm kind of engaging in that more intellectual question of God and that sort of thing, and people are asking me, hey, give me one good reason why God exists. There's a whole number of arguments you could reach for, but one of my favorites is the question of, well, why do you believe that life, what do you believe is the purpose of life? That might be my opening question. I'd want to kind of ask them, kind of get something from them, sort of get a sense of what they believe about life. What's the point? Where do we, where do we come from? Why are we here? Is there any point to it? And that might be a great introduction, depending on their answer, to me kind of saying, well, here's the way I see it as a Christian. I think that actually the fact that we are even here to ask this question suggests that there's something more, that we're here for a reason, for a purpose, and that actually there are lots of signposts, if you like, towards God in the universe, in our experience, in the fact that we're all looking to make sense of life at some level. So that might be where I'd begin. It would only be the very beginnings of a conversation, but I'd want to start firstly by asking how they try to make sense of life, and then off that say, well, here's a way that my Christian faith maybe begins to answer those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. I like that because it's open-ended and it's not lectury. It's just let's have a discussion, which I know is what you're passionate about. One of the things that you talk about frequently is defending like the resurrection. How do you tell me about that a little bit too?
Well,
all the big deep questions, just
no,
right
it's
off
fine.
the bat.
It's absolutely fine. I love it, and I think this is a really interesting one, because a lot of people assume that the resurrection of Jesus is something Christians kind of just believe on, quote unquote, faith. That it's not something you could necessarily know or test or whatever. It's just a kind of, it's there in the Bible and you just have to believe it or not believe it. I don't think it is quite like that, though. I think the way I see it is that this isn't just a sort of, hey, could have happened, maybe it didn't happen, you just have to have faith to believe it. It's a genuinely historical question, first of all. It's a question that is kind of open to investigation in that sense. And a lot of the skeptics and atheists that I've met over the course of my life, I've never really encountered that idea that actually the Bible itself is not just a kind of moral rule book. That's the way a lot of people think of it. But it's actually a set of historical documents. It's the kind of historical documents that many historians of the ancient world kind of regard as almost unparalleled in terms of what it tells us about the ancient world and the way it puts us in touch with that era. And that's never been more true of any documents than the Gospels and the early letters of Paul and the account of the early church in Acts. These are actually, when you look at them, compared to other historical documents of the same era, they are absolutely head and shoulders above the others in terms of their authenticity, their early provenance, how closely they were written to the events that they describe. There's all kinds of ways in which the number of copies we have of them in existence, there's so many ways in which actually the Bible is more than just a kind of religious text. It's actually a really interesting set of historical documents. And one of the events in those historical documents that some of the authors give the most time to are the events around Jesus' death and resurrection. So we have just a wealth of actual historical evidence here, more sort of detail and evidence for the death and the claim of Jesus' resurrection than we might have for lots of other major historical events that, no one ever kind of questions in the historical world. That the crossing of the Rubicon by Caesar is a major historical event, of the ancient world. No one doubts it. It's there. But we have far better textual evidence for the death of Jesus on the cross than for any of those kinds of events. And so a lot of it kind of sometimes brings up my skeptical friends a bit short when they realize, oh, actually, this isn't just a kind of funny old religious book. It's actually a book that's got this kind of historical aspect to it. And you kind of need to take that seriously. And then I would want to sort of say, okay, well, look, it's a book of history, but, maybe they were just making it up. Maybe, these were just exaggerated tales, whatever. And then the question to go is, well, let's apply some historical sort of ways of looking at this text and ask, does it make sense? And there are if you don't mind me kind of just taking a bit of time to lay this out, getting nerdy, getting geeky here.
I love it.
Apologies, Steph. There are maybe 4 or 5 key things that I'd want to point out to someone who's maybe skeptical about whether any of this stuff really happened, okay, as reported in the Gospels. And I'd want to say this. There are 5 particular data points that the majority of historians agree on, whether they're believing Christians or skeptics, agnostics. These are kind of the consensus among historians of this era about these stories as we find them in these historical documents in the Gospels and Paul's letters and so on. And here they are. Firstly, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Like I said, you could hardly find a fact of ancient history that is better attested than that one. Okay, in all 4 Gospels, in lots of extra biblical accounts and things, it's clear that Jesus Christ of Nazareth died by Roman crucifixion. The second thing that has the broad consensus of scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, is that his empty tomb was discovered by a group of his female followers. Okay. Now, this is an interesting one because why do a lot of scholars who don't necessarily have Christian beliefs actually believe that this probably did happen, actually? Well, it's partly because one of the unusual things about the ancient world is that in that day and age, the testimony of a woman was worth far less than that of a man, in the ancient world. And so if you were inventing a story about a crucified and resurrected Messiah, the last thing you would do is make the first discoverers of the empty tomb women, because that kind of goes against your interests, basically, if you're trying to persuade people of it, and it's not true. And yet, in all 4 of the Gospels, women are the first discoverers of the empty tomb. The historians describe this as the criterion of embarrassment. If it's kind of embarrassing, it's more likely that it happened. And it was kind of embarrassing for the early Christians to I mean, the modern analogy I use for this is that I once had this awful incident where I was going into work on the commuter train in the morning, and I managed to inadvertently spill my flask of coffee all over the laptop of the person next to me. And I just wanted the ground to swallow me up in that moment. Mm-hmm. And maybe you've got a similar embarrassing episode in your life. But the reason you can be pretty sure that story is true is because it's embarrassing for me to tell. We don't make up things that kind of, make us look bad. And this, believe it or not, was a kind of embarrassing fact of the early church, that women were the first discoverers of the empty tomb. So it's very unlikely they made that up. It's more likely that they just sort of gritted their teeth and said, yeah, we'll hold our hands up. Women were the first discoverers of the empty tomb. But it makes it much more likely that it really happened. You've got the empty tomb discovered by a group of Jesus' female followers. You've got also the fact that various people reported meeting the risen Jesus. And again, this is something that the majority of scholars, Christian or non-Christian, agree on, that something happened, that people reported some kind of encounter with the risen Jesus. And we have this in the writings of, the accounts we have of Peter and the disciples and the women and others on the road to Emmaus. Even if those scholars don't necessarily say it was the risen Jesus, they know that something happened. You've got to give some kind of an explanation for these accounts. Okay. The fourth thing you've got is the conversion of people who were dead set against the Christian movement. Jesus' brother James became the leader of the early Jerusalem church. But we know from the gospel accounts, he was actually a skeptic of this movement. Saul, as he was originally called, was a persecutor of the church. And yet he had this extraordinary turnaround moment. And again, this is just a historically given fact of we know it from the letters of Paul. There's so much evidence. And you've got to ask, well, what makes someone go from being a skeptic and a persecutor of the church to suddenly a believer and in time, the world's greatest evangelist? So, and then you've got your fifth fact, which is the way in which this early church exploded onto the first century world scene. What accounts for this sudden explosion of people, this kind of dejected group of disciples suddenly becoming this bold, fearless group of people willing to suffer persecution, shipwreck, death for the sake of, a lie? And you put all of these factors together: Jesus' death by crucifixion, the discovery of his tomb by a group of his female followers, his purported appearance to a number of people, the conversion of skeptics, the explosion of the early church. Again, these are all, as I say, facts that are agreed upon by the majority of scholars, skeptical, non-Christian, Christian. And you're looking at that just from a historical perspective, you've got to ask, well, what's the best explanation of all these facts? I'm not asking someone to believe that the Bible is divinely inspired. I'm not asking them to kind of suspend their critical reasoning. I'm not asking them to kind of in a sense, I'm just moving on to their ground and saying, look, let's just look at this historically and ask what's the best explanation. And I think the natural explanation is the one that the first followers gave, that Jesus rose from the dead. I think that's a perfectly valid explanation. It fits the data very well. I could go into a whole extra thing about other possible theories, hallucinations, mistaken bodies, all those sorts of things. What I found is when you run them all through those facts, if you like, those historical facts, none of them really make sense of the facts in the way the explanation that was actually given makes sense of the fact. So for me, I'd want to, for a skeptic, I'd want to just say, let's take this onto your turf. Let's talk about this kind of without kind of asking you to believe in miracles and, believe in the authority of scripture or any of that stuff. Let's just look at it a purely historical way. What's the best explanation for this very interesting set of historical data? And I think that might just open the door to the idea that, this stuff does kind of fit together with the explanation they gave. And who knows, that could be the beginning of an interesting conversation.
Yeah. No, I think that's so interesting. So very interesting. Another big question that skeptics ask, and truthfully, all believers, I think, at some point or another, is the question of suffering and why does God allow suffering? And I think that's a big holdup that people have. And even just when you're wrestling with your own faith and you're like, but Jesus, I love you so much. Like, how did you let this terrible thing happen to me? So how do we answer that question?
Yeah. Again, you're tossing me the easy ones today, Steph. I can see that. Kind of like,
you're welcome.
Start easy. No, I mean, no, obviously it's a really important question, probably the most commonly asked question of all of them.
Yeah. So you guys have probably heard me talk about IXL before, and that is because I truly love it. IXL is an online learning program that enriches your homeschool curriculum or offers a little more support at home that balances your school curriculum. It offers practice in math, English, language arts, science, and social studies. It adapts to each child, meeting them exactly where they are. So I have one kid who gets a little bored in math class and he wants more of a challenge. So I've used IXL to give him a little more work at home and really push him in his favorite subject. And then I have another child who's kind of struggled through some of his math units. And so we use IXL to get him a little more practice before those unit tests so that he feels more confident. And it has seriously been such a helpful tool for our family. IXL is easy to use. Everything is organized by grade, subject, topic, and subtopic, making it really simple to find activities for the exact skills that your kids are covering. IXL also offers instant feedback and explanations of new topics as kids use the program. So it's really helpful if you're using it to get a little extra support and practice in a particular subject. Like my family, you can make an impact on your child's learning and get IXL now. And Christian Parenting Podcast listeners can get an exclusive 20% off IXL memberships when they sign up today at IXL.com/today. Again, you can visit IXL.com/today to get the most effective learning program out there at the very best price. I know as a mom, it is so easy to put everybody else's needs ahead of yours. And I know this because I do it too. But when hormonal changes start to take a toll on your body, it is definitely time to start taking care of you. Hormone health is so much more than just a few symptoms. It affects everything from your moods, your energy levels, to how you cope with stress. If you're a woman, you know how easily hormones can get out of balance, especially with all the daily stresses of life. And when that happens, it can feel like everything else is off too. But what if there is a simple habit that you could add to your routine that could make a huge difference? That's where Hormone Harmony by Happy Mammoth comes in. Happy Mammoth, the company that started Hormone Harmony, is dedicated to making women's lives easier, especially moms. And that means using only science-backed ingredients that have been proven to work for women. They make no compromise when it comes to quality, and it shows. The results are so impressive, you guys. There are over 40,000 reviews on their website, and women cannot stop talking about it on social media and in real life too. I know so many people who use Hormone Harmony and absolutely love it. In fact, a bottle of Hormone Harmony is sold every 24 seconds. For a limited time, you can get 15% off your entire first order at happymammoth.com. Just use the code CPPodcast at checkout. That's happymammoth.com and use the code CPPodcast for 15% off today.
The first thing I'd want to start with, honestly, is before just diving into a kind of philosophical or theological sort of explanation, I'd want to know where the question is coming from for the person, honestly, because there's times when I've seen people answer this question and they go straight in with a sort of, great answer, potentially a logical answer, but that's not necessarily what that person needs at that point.
Right.
If that person's coming from a place of pain, they maybe just have gone through a really difficult set of circumstances, maybe lost a loved one, whatever it is. The place to begin may not be a sort of rational philosophical answer. It might be just to honestly weep with them and just commiserate with them and be there for them. And it might be that those intellectual questions need to kind of come a bit later rather than up front. So I'd just be very careful, because these are such important, deep issues for people, to sort of gauge what actually that person really needs in that moment. But once, if the time comes for, a more intellectual approach to that question, and, it's one that, like I say, my kids have asked me this in a million different ways, but it all revolves around the same thing. If God is good, if God is all loving, why does bad stuff happen? Why do we see a world where there's so much pain and suffering? So there's a few different directions I would go with this. Firstly, I'd want to explain that a lot of the evil suffering that exists in the world can't be laid at God's feet. It's not God's fault. It's our fault. Okay. Because God has given us free will, freedom. And the problem is that if we lived in a world where every time we were about to do something wrong, steal from someone, lie, cheat, hurt someone, if God stepped in and sort of overruled our freedom to make that choice, waved a magic wand to make sure we didn't do it, the problem is we would just be puppets. We would be robots that we wouldn't have any freedom to speak of. Now, would that be a better world if God just stepped in every time and overruled our freedom? Well, not necessarily, because actually freedom itself is a really important thing. It's kind of what makes us human, the freedom to choose, to love. You can't speak of love if it's not freely given and received. But the flip side of that is that we can hate as well. And so I'd first of all want to point out that a lot of the damage we see in the world comes from the freedom, us misusing our human freedom. And it's not as simple as just saying, well, God shouldn't allow that. Well, maybe there are kind of things that God has to allow in order for us to be truly human. He has to allow a degree of freedom in our lives and so on. So that might be a place to begin. It's one way in to kind of thinking this through at a sort of logical level, if you like. But then inevitably people may ask the next question, but what about those kinds of evil and suffering that don't seem so dependent on our human freedom? Earthquakes, random tragedies, disease. This is what you might call natural evil. And for this one, there are no easy answers to any of this. So I'm not suggesting these are just, just say this and it's sorted. All of these kind of require almost a lifetime. But one way into this question is to really ask, well, how do I make sense of this as a Christian? And what you find in the Bible, in the story that we've been given, is that there is an explanation for this, that there is this thing that happened at some point in human history called the fall. That there's this idea that sin came into the world and that it kind of knocked the whole of creation off kilter. And the idea is that we live in a world that is beautiful yet broken at the same time. It's kind of it's still got its original character, but it's kind of flawed. And I see those aspects of the creation as being what Paul describes in the book of Romans as the groaning of creation. It's something that desires and is waiting to be set free from its bondage to decay. That's the words Paul uses in Romans 8. And it's this idea that, something's gone wrong and the world isn't the way it should be. And every fiber in our being screams out against, the tragedy and the disease and the death that stalks us. We know that that's not the way life should be somehow. And yet that is the way our world is. And it's because it's been infected in the Christian view with sin. There's it's kind of sent this kind of shockwave through the whole of the universe. And it's kind of created this world that's in this tension because, there's this kind of there's this curious contradiction in our world. Why does an earthquake happen? Well, it happens when the natural forces of two tectonic plates shifting against each other create, this disturbance. But that very same force is actually necessary for refreshing the surface of the earth with minerals and that kind of thing. So it's like it's kind of this tension that we live in of a world that is for us and yet acts against us sometimes. Likewise, disease, where does cancer come from? Well, it comes when the replication of cells misfire and you get this cancer. But we know that replication is important for life, for human life to develop normally and everything. So we're living in this kind of in-between of this beauty and this brokenness of our creation. And I think that fits well with, as I say, what's described in the Bible as this moment we're living in. The question really then is, has God done anything about it? And yeah, the answer is yes. God came in person to be the solution to this. And through his death and resurrection, Christians believe that God has, if you like, planted a flag in that enemy soil, in that sort of place of this beauty and this brokenness by dying himself, experiencing the brokenness. But through that resurrection and this hope of a new world, a redeemed, restored, new creation. And we're all being invited, if we call ourselves followers of Christ, to join in this project of bringing this new kingdom, this new world into being. And it's difficult. It's often tragic, but actually there's something about joining in with God's, rescue project of this world that is also the most meaningful thing you can possibly do with your life. And so this is why I would say this doesn't in any way get rid of the sting of the problem of suffering, but it does help us to make sense of it at some level, that to see it within this kind of framework of what God is doing in the world. And most especially to know that whether or not these kind of answers satisfy at an intellectual level, God understands our pain precisely because he's entered into it. The reason we worship a God who got himself crucified is because that is the most profound statement of God recognizing and understanding our pain. He knew what it was to be betrayed, humiliated, to experience grief, oppression, persecution, torture, death. So we don't have a God who stands far off. And sometimes that's the only thing that ultimately can give someone comfort in the end, rather than any kind of intellectual answers I may have. It may just be knowing that God gets it, God knows what it's like, and they can hold on to that. So those would kind of be the kinds of places I might go to with someone who's asking those big questions.
Yeah. You mentioned a bit ago that all your kids have come to you with that question at some point. So and my kids have asked the same, my nephews have asked me the same. I feel like a lot of little kids have asked me that question. So when our kids come to us with questions like why is there suffering, or any of the questions that they may have, how did you respond to them? How do we best respond to them? I would assume that you would agree that the response, because the Bible said so, is probably not good enough or complete enough. So where do we go? How do we explain it to them?
Well, I think you obviously have to take some of these big picture ideas and then try and, give them a level that's age appropriate and
Correct.
Right for the circumstance of that child. So the answer I give to my 19-year-old might be different to my 9-year-old. I think a lot of the time I want to kind of enter into the specific of the thing that's, as I say, generated that question. I remember when I was, I think he would have been 7 or 8 years old at the time. My youngest son had just been having a really tough time with some of his friends, and he was really upset about it, as you are at that age when your friendship group falls out and there are difficult things.
I still get upset by that.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Who doesn't? But I remember, trying to talk it through with him and help him to see, look, this happens. Friends fall in and out with each other. The important thing is how you respond and to try and love your friends even when it's difficult to do so. And just to explain, that God knows how you're feeling. God experienced his friends betraying him. You're not alone in this. But the good news is God is with you in all of those circumstances. I tried to give a very kind of a way that he's got something to hold on to. It wouldn't have been appropriate in that instance to go into the highly philosophical things about, well, your hands are using their freedom and it's and what. So, it just wasn't the right kind of way to frame. I wanted to go. What was lovely about this story I'm thinking of, though, the reason I bring up this example was that later on in that evening, we went to we kind of run a kind of uniformed organization, a Christian organization called Boys and Girls Brigades at our church. And my son goes along. And it just so happened that the theme of the kind of scriptural teaching that they were doing that evening was on friendship. And they were taking the story of David and Jonathan and their friendship and sort of expanding on that. And it was so beautiful because at the end of the evening, he came up to me and said, I think God was talking to me tonight. And it was just this beautiful moment where he was able to say, I feel like, God kind of came along and helped to answer, the problem and the pain I was having today. And I was so glad for that, because there's a kind of, often with children, actually, there's more of an openness actually to see God answering in ways that sometimes adults sometimes would struggle to do so. And for me, that's part of the beauty, hopefully, of being around a loving Christian community, is it gives those opportunities, not just for theological explanations, but those are important, but also just for opportunities for God to speak directly, and for those beautiful moments when something comes together and he was in the right place at the right time to hear something that really helped him.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And you so often find that in community, not on your own.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So what if your kids are older and they come and they say, like, I don't believe in God. This isn't my thing anymore. Like, how do you handle that? Or I guess another way to put it would be like, what's the worst way to respond and the best way to respond to a kid like that?
Yeah. Well, you're more there describing my kind of middle son, who's much more
Mm.
of the skeptic, and he's just wired differently to the other kids. He kind of
He's
takes things
16?
So no, he's our
16?
13-year-old.
13. Okay.
Yeah. So and he's kind of very logical in his approach, and he doesn't necessarily intuit or feel the kind of the God vibes in the way that maybe some of the other kids kind of do. Do you know what I mean? And
Yes. Yeah.
and so I have just a different kind of conversation with him a lot of the time around faith in God. And he's definitely, we don't, I live in the UK. Being a Christian is more unusual on average than maybe in the States. We don't have a kind of big Christian school network, for starters. And even though my kids go to what we call a Church of England school, the vast majority of the kids there are not Christians. They don't go to church. And a lot of my 13-year-old son's friendship group are functionally kind of skeptical atheist kind of kids. They certainly don't believe in God. So he's definitely kind of experienced this firsthand, and so a lot of the conversations we've ended up having around the dinner table with my wife and our kids is kind of, hey, what talking about what their friends came up with and some of the things they said, and well, what would you say to this, Dad? And he says, what about this and that? So yeah, I've definitely had the more kind of, if you like, analytical, philosophical conversations with Jeremy, because that's kind of the way he's wired, and it's the kinds of conversations he's having with his friends. And the thing that's really lit him up has been like when I've, for instance, shared a video with him. I made a video several years ago called Why a Dice Can Show That God Exists. And it's just a sort of 5-minute video that you can find on YouTube. And in it, I just use a dice, a 6-sided die, to kind of explain the way in which, just how crazy it is that we got the idea that we got lucky in the cosmic roll of the dice, and that we exist basically in the universe. When you look at what it took for us to exist, there's this phenomenon in science called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And just to try and explain it very briefly, it's this fact that we've discovered through our best science that the universe, when it came into being, was birthed with a set of numbers and physical laws that seem to defy explanation, because they're so incredibly well dialed to the precision they need to have in order for life to get going in the universe. This would be things like the force of gravity. If it was ever so slightly stronger than it is, then everything would have collapsed back in on itself. You wouldn't get life. Ever so slightly weaker than it is, everything would have flown out too quickly for chemistry and atoms and stars and galaxies to develop. No life. So what was the degree of precision? How fine-tuned is it? And it turns out that if it differed from its actual value in 1 part in 10 to the 60, so that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it, you don't get life in the universe. Now, I was trying to think of an analogy. What's like the odds of kind of getting it right, first time? And I said, well, imagine you were throwing a dice, okay, and you were trying to roll a 6, okay, well, you're going to roll, 1 in 6 chance of doing that. So pretty good odds. Well, what about rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, it kind of racks up exponentially. To throw 2 6s in a row would actually be 1 in 36, because it's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. Anyway, you keep going. So I said, what are the odds of throwing 76s in a row? Well, it turns out the odds are around 1 in 10 to the 60, this number of the fine-tuning of the universe. And so I said, well, how long then, on average, would you have to stand here rolling this dice before getting your lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row, with the odds being 1 in 10 to the 60 that you do that? And I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. This is just kind of fun, and it's kind of like, I'm trying to appeal to the geeky mathematicians and nerdy types, with all this stuff. And it turns out the mathematician said you would have to, I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like you would have to roll that dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years. It was a number of that kind of magnitude.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of
huge
amount of time you would have to just keep rolling before you hit that. And I said, So imagine that you were just with someone and they just rolled 70 times and 6 every time. You would never say, oh, that was lucky. You would go, that's impossible. That does not happen. Okay. And it's like that with the universe. You can't just say, we got here by chance. It was luck. That's the odds, the numbers just don't stack up that way. It's not possible. And the force of gravity is just one among about 20 or 30 of these even more finely tuned constants. And so it's this thing that the scientists call the fine tuning of the universe for life. And by kind of explaining it with this dice analogy and basically just coming to the conclusion and saying, look, you are not here by a kind of cosmic roll of chance. All right. The evidence points to you being the product of an intelligent mind who wanted you to be here. And that's worth thinking about. And my son just loved this video and he went and showed it to his friends and it was just the right thing for him. It was kind of the thing he needed to kind of give him a bit of confidence to go and have the conversation with his friends. And yeah, that was, so I think finding the right way in for your child, if it's a conversation about the existence of God, what's going to float their boat? As I say, my son is he's wired in that kind of more mathematical, logical way. And that was the thing that just gave him that confidence to kind of step into those conversations with his friends a bit more. And that might be, a helpful little resource for someone else. It's a really simple video, as I say, called Why a Dice Can Show That God Exists. And yeah, a lot of people have found it just a helpful way in for opening up those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I'll link that in show notes because I want to find it too and show it to my son. He has such a strong, my middle also, has such a strong faith. It's a tender heart for Jesus, but he is very math minded. He does the math Olympics every year. He loves it. So I think he would find that really cool. And I like that you shared that too, because all of our kids are wired so differently. And I think as parents, if faith is really important to us, we can kind of panic a little bit if it doesn't come naturally for our kids, and be like, what do I do? Like, how do I explain this? And we don't have to be afraid of the science and the math to point out God's truth.
Yeah, and I would just echo that absolutely, because as I say, we've got 4 kids and they are all so different. And some of them have kind of walked into faith in a very kind of natural way where they just, like I say, they just feel it, they feel their way into it and it makes sense. And others not so much. And it's kind of like, okay, that's not going to be your path. Let's find out what the things are that are going to help you. And of course, as you know, there are no guarantees in parenting. It's a bit like, when God chose to have children, he kind of gave them free rein. They could go and make mistakes and they weren't necessarily going to follow him perfectly and all of that. You're doing the same thing when you have kids. You do your best. You try and set them a good example. You try and answer their questions best you can, put them right. But they're free agents too, and they're going to have a different path to the one you had. They're going to have a different path to each other. There's a point at which, you just have to accept that you can do what you can do, but you kind of also have to trust God has got them as well. And it's not all down to you in the end,
Which is so hard because we would like it to be.
Of course we would.
It would be much easier that way if we could just direct their path. Just
the control freak in us comes out, doesn't it? And we just want to make everything perfect for our kids. I mean, it kind of takes me back to the suffering thing, actually, in a funny way, because one of the ways in which I talk to people about why would God allow suffering, I kind of sometimes put it back in them, especially if they're a parent, I say, well, why did you choose to have kids? Because by bringing those kids into the world, they are going to experience some suffering in the world. They're going to experience pain. And yet you chose to create a situation in which someone would experience pain and suffering. Why would you do that? And the usual answer they give is, well, I guess because the good will outweigh the bad. I want to give them the chance of experiencing love and goodness and everything. And I'm like, well, maybe it's the same with God. Maybe that's a good answer to why God would bring us into the world, even with all the difficulties and pain we experience. It's because there's something he wants to do for us and through us and in us. And maybe, in fact, the difficulty we experience in a kind of cosmic way is actually part of what actually shapes us into being people who love, who grow into the likeness of God and Christ. It's often through those experiences and that pain that we get shaped. And I think that again might be helpful with children and young people to sort of help them to realize that God is like a parent. That's one of the key metaphors, one of the key images we're given of God throughout Scripture. And a good parent, at least, doesn't actually wrap their kids in cotton wool and stop them from ever experiencing any pain. When I taught my kids how to ride a bicycle, I knew there were going to be some scrapes and bumps along the way, but it was worth it for what they would learn and the way they would grow and develop. And I think it's the same with God. I found that quite a helpful analogy. God's not a kind of divine babysitter who has to just keep us comfortable and safe. God is actually a parent, and that means actually sometimes allowing us to experience things that might be difficult and painful, but actually will help us to grow if we're open to allowing it. And very often, it's been my experience many times that it's precisely those kinds of circumstances, difficult circumstances, that actually draw people towards God. It's very often comfort, ease, safety that means people kind of forget about God. And it's often God using those circumstances to actually draw people to himself, like a loving parent. It's not a perfect analogy, but I've kind of find that one helpful too.
Yeah. No, that is so beautiful and so true. And I think a encouragement for parents. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I love what you're doing. I think it is so important and so encouraging and just really a lot to think about. So I'm really grateful that you're sharing your wisdom with us in just a very approachable way too. So I would love to wrap up our time with my final question. And that is, what is one thing that you want every parent to know?
I want every parent to know that it's okay to fail at parenting, because we have failed many times because we're human. But that's okay, because actually part of what it is to be a model to your kids is to not model perfection, but to model what it means to be an imperfect human, but who is dependent upon the grace of God. And I think that's probably the most important thing we can do for our kids, because we can sometimes project a sort of perfect Christian family vibe. And when it doesn't work out, it looks like it was just a sham. It was just a failure. Families are always more complicated than that in real life. And I just want to encourage parents to maybe look on Instagram at that perfect Christian family, and think, why isn't mine like that? Trust me, it's not as perfect as it looks. And there are going to be failures, okay? And you will fail. It's just a given in life, okay? I failed my children and my wife many, many times over, okay? But what I hope I can model is saying sorry, even to my kids when I mess up, and just saying, I'm as imperfect in the end as anyone, but I've got this God who covers that. And if I can come to you and say, I'm sorry, say to God, I'm sorry, let's start this again. That might be actually what your kids need to see, rather than some kind of picture perfect, that none of us can actually ever live up to. So that, go easy on yourself. You will fail. As long as you've got God with you, it'll be okay.
I think that's what I needed to hear today. So thank you. Thank you for speaking directly to me today.
Glad to hear.
Yes.
Bless
Can you tell us where we can connect with you and get your book and listen to your podcast and all the things?
Absolutely. Well, the book is called Why I'm Still a Christian, and you can find that just by searching it up on Amazon. It's published by Tyndale, and just wherever you find books are sold. Why I'm Still a Christian after 20 years of talking with skeptics and atheists. So just look for Justin Brierley. My website is justinbrierley.com, and you can find links to the book there, also to my podcast, my social media, and that kind of thing. But book, Why I'm Still a Christian, website, justinbrierley.com.
Perfect. I'll get that all linked up in show notes. But thank you so much for being here. I know you're so busy and have a lot going on, so I appreciate your time a lot. Thank you.
It was a delight to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this episode encouraged you to lean into the big questions with your kids and reminded you that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about walking together in trust and honesty and grace. If today's episode really resonated with you, we'd love for you to share with a friend, subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes, and leave a review too. It really helps us reach more parents who are navigating the same journey and may also have the questions that you have. So as you head into your week, may you be filled with courage to have meaningful conversations, grace for the moments when the answers don't come easily, and confidence that God is at work in your kids' hearts, even in the questions. May His truth anchor your family, and may His love guide every step of your way. God bless you. We'll see you next week. I know that you want to raise your kids to know, love, and follow Jesus. But let's be honest, parenting with faith in today's world can feel really overwhelming. And that's why at Christian Parenting, we're here to equip you with the practical tools, encouragement, and biblical wisdom that you need to confidently lead your kids in faith. If you love listening to the Christian Parenting Podcast, and I really hope you do, you won't want to miss our Friday Favorites newsletter. Each week, we're going to send you quick, practical parenting tips, faith-building resources, and encouragement straight to your inbox so you never feel alone on this journey. And here's something special just for podcast listeners. When you sign up today, we'll send you a free copy of our Discipleship Simplified digital guide. It is packed with easy-to-use resources, conversation starters, and scripts to help you confidently answer your kids' tough faith questions. So don't miss out. Subscribe now at cppodcast.org to get the Friday Favorites newsletter and your free Discipleship Simplified guide. That's cppodcast.org, or just click the link in the show notes.